Oh, by the way, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. So I was looking at some of my Blender videos and noticed something. All right, so in a pretty default Blender scene here, so I am in a pretty basic default Blender 3.1 scene. All right, so I'm in a pretty default Blender 3.0 beta scene here. So there's this certain phrase. All right, so I'm in a pretty basic Blender 2.93.3 scene. So what I have here is a pretty much default Blender 2.92 scene. Did you catch that? What I got here is a basic Blender scene. I've got a pretty much a basic Blender scene set up here. What I've got here is pretty much a basic Blender scene, pretty much basically default. So what does pretty much basically default actually mean? Well, it means I've been hiding some of my sneaky little settings the past several years. Now these are settings I've never covered before. Since a new version of Blender came out recently, I found myself in a similar situation where I needed to make adjustments to all the settings to get Blender just the way I like. Blender is great out of the box, but there are a few things that I just cannot live without. These are things that make my life just a little bit easier, and you might like them as well. So let's talk about those sneaky little settings right now. All right, so here I am in an actually default Blender 3.2 scene. Just downloaded it again just to make sure I had the most recent version, but just to prove it to you, I'm going to go up into defaults and load factory settings, which will load the settings as they should be right when you download Blender. So let's jump into it. The first thing I'm going to do is, for the sake of visibility, I'm going to go up here into my edit preferences, which is where we'll be doing many of these things. And then in the interface, I'm going to change the resolution scale up to something like a 1.25 or something like that. Getting a little bit older, things are a little harder to see, so the resolution scale makes things easier to see, of course. And of course, since this is a tutorial and I want you to be able to see what I'm clicking on, that's another reason why I do it. So when I'm recording tutorials, that's another reason why I have the resolution scale a little bit higher, just so that you can see where I'm clicking. But I actually usually work in that resolution scale as well, just because, you know, my monitor is big enough. I can get everything in there I need to. Make it as big as you want, but yeah, usually a 1.25 works pretty well for me. So the next things we're going to change are in the viewport tab. That's not true. It's in the navigation tab, is going to be right here. So auto depth is going to improve view pan functionality, view pan rotate functionality using the depth under the mouse. So when that's off, you know, you can zoom in and it's just kind of like keeps going and it's not great. And, you know, if you're just trying to look at this edge, you don't want to go through it. So it's going to, by turning that on, it's going to allow us to scroll in and like not go into our object. So, you know, now when we zoom in, it's gonna allow us to like kind of get in on that corner. So it's going to be a more fine-tuned scroll depending on how close an object is under your mouse cursor. So great setting to have. And while I was trying to do that, I was noticing another big issue, which is the next setting we're going to change, which is going to be zoom to mouse position. So when that's off, it's always going to zoom into just the middle of your viewport. So if you want to get to something in particular, you got to kind of keep panning, keep moving around until it's right in the center. But there is a better way. So zoom to mouse position is going to zoom to your mouse position. So now we can zoom right into that corner just by moving our mouse there. And if I wanted to look at the light, I could zoom in over there. If I want to look at the camera, I can zoom in over here. And this just helps a lot for zooming in and zooming out. It's just a lot more convenient, I think. I kind of feel like that should be on by default, but I can imagine, you know, maybe that's confusing to some people, or maybe that's the default in other software. Not totally sure, but love that setting. Can't live without it. Now, I believe the last one in this section that I like to change is the orbit around selection option. So when I turn that on, that will allow me to orbit around my selection. So you can see that now that camera is just staying right there, locked on the origin, right in the middle. Similarly, if I were going to select this cube, it's now going to stay locked right there. You could put your finger on the screen and the cube would stay right underneath it. When that is off, it will not do that. It's going to orbit around, I guess, the center of your screen, something like that. So, you know, if the cube is in the center, yeah, see, it kind of gets a little bit off there. But when I have that on, it's just going to stay right where it was. Very, very convenient. Gotta have that setting. Now the next little navigation thing that is not so much a setting, but more just a convenience thing for me is going to be down here in the key map. So there is one thing I like to do, which is jump between a lot of objects in a Blender scene. So if I want to, zoom to mouse position helps you a lot with that. But sometimes you want to, the scale of the objects might be different. Like let's make that one smaller. So rather than kind of like having to zoom in so much, there is this command, which by default is numpad period. So if we press that, that's a command called frame selected, which whatever you have selected, it's going to kind of put it full frame in your window. And that's very convenient, especially when your scenes are starting to get a little bit complex and with differently scaled objects. So because that's something I use so much and I don't want to move my hand over to the numpad period, I like to actually change that to a button I have on my mouse. Now I'm using the Logitech MX Vertical, which has a little a little button by my thumb, and a lot of mouses nowadays will have like one extra button. You can get a mouse with a ton of buttons. Like when I used to play World of Warcraft, there was I had the Naga or whatever it was called. It's got like 20 buttons on it, so I could, didn't want my teammates dying. But anyways, enough about that. I'm going to search for the name of it. So it's called frame selected. So if we type that in, that's going to reveal everywhere that has that key. And now this is not just a viewport thing, but it's also in the graph editor, other places, down here in the timeline. So, for example, the dope sheet, I don't really use the dope sheet, but I'm going to go ahead and change it there because when I want to frame selected, I want it to be that little button on my mouse. So just everywhere it says numpad period, I'm going to press that little button on my mouse, which is called button 4 mouse. So that even works in like the file browser. So just changing that literally everywhere. So that was all good. Now I can just, real quick, like switch between different things. I can find different objects, frame them, camera, frame it. Really makes navigating quite a bit faster. Now, of course, all these settings are very minimal things, but like I said, when you're using Blender as much as I am, just any little thing to make your life a little bit easier is really convenient. So that's about it for those primary settings I wanted to cover. Now we all know Blender is a difficult software to learn and getting the settings just right can take some time, but I want to take a second to talk about something that is not difficult and does not take much time at all, and that's setting up your own website with Squarespace. Once you're well on your way to creating amazing things in Blender and you start thinking about taking on clients, my best advice is always to start putting your work out there. A website is the best way to do this. With a host of ready-to-rock, gorgeous templates, Squarespace makes the website creation process easier than it's ever been before. I actually made my first ever site with Squarespace, and look at me now. Creating a portfolio is one thing, but there's even more that you can set up on Squarespace, like creating a custom contact form, setting up an online shop, or simply just showing off your work to the world. It's very easy with Squarespace. Head on over to squarespace.com/Dirk for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. The next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit more on the system side. So edit preferences. So in the system tab down here, the undo steps by default I think is 32. And now depending on how much memory your computer has or how much memory you want to let Blender use, you might want to leave this at the default, but this is just basically how many times you can undo. So every time you take an action, Blender's going to log that, but it's only going to log the last 32. So you can only undo so many times. So you might want to turn this up, whatever you want. I usually maybe, turn up to 96 or something like that. But I like to be able to undo a lot because I realize I'm pressing like so many commands and doing so many things. So what I think was just a couple steps ago, sometimes is more like 96 steps ago. So it's nice to have some extra undo limits there, undo steps, and you can actually define a memory usage there as well. So also in the system settings, make sure if you have graphics cards that you have those enabled for CUDA rendering, optics if you've got that enabled. But yeah, just make sure that, maybe you got a new computer, you've got fresh graphics cards, and your stuff just isn't working as fast. Make sure that they're enabled here. So just make sure that those two are enabled. I have two 2080 Ti's, so both of those are checked. And then the other thing I'll do is just over here in my settings, in cycles, I'll change that from CPU to GPU compute. And that will, that'll make sure that you're using those GPUs, because by default it's still set to CPU. There's been many times where I open up, a new version of Blender and I'm rendering and it's just seeming really slow. And then I realize like my computer is almost on fire over next to me. So make sure your GPU compute is selected if you have GPUs on. And also, people always ask me about my system specs. Is this a good computer? Is that a good computer? I really don't know a ton about hardware, but the most important thing if you want to get a better Blender computer is to get some powerful GPUs. That's going to be sort of the key takeaway from any hardware advice that I'll give you ever. Now, if we were to open up a new version of Blender, don't save, I think that all of our settings are going to be pretty much good. Yeah, so all, zoom to mouse position, that's all still in place. I've still got my hotkey on my mouse for framing things selected. But this did carry over. Sometimes it doesn't, but it looks like that carried over between versions. I was wondering, because sometimes you need to go up here to defaults and save startup file. Certain things I think you need to save the startup file, but for most of those things in the preferences and apparently right here, those were retained between versions. Like we can just check that real quick in the system. Yeah, so our undo step's still at 96, and then as we could see, all our navigation things were all the same as well. So that's great. Next thing I want to talk about are quick favorites. Now you can have as many quick favorites as you want. They're accessed by pressing Q on your keyboard. You can see I don't have anything in the menu now, but there is one that I like to add. Let's add in a cylinder right there. So that would be the auto smooth. So right click, shade this smooth. It's trying to smooth the whole object, but we know what we want. We want that to stay sharp, and we want the outside to be smooth. So if we shade that flat, you can see we've got that banding there. So you would normally right click, shade it smooth, but now it's not doing that. And rather than adding in bevels and things like that, there's this really convenient option down here in the normals to turn on auto smooth. And what that's going to do is allow you to define an angle where Blender will say, okay, that's not supposed to be smooth, that's supposed to be sharp. And that's a really convenient thing. And I use it a lot. So right click, add it to quick favorites, and now I can quickly toggle that on. That's just something I use a lot when I'm working with materials and modeling. So having that available in quick favorites is great. Now, quick favorites work in object mode and edit mode. So if you can see, we go into edit mode and now we press Q and there are no quick favorites because they are a separate set of quick favorites. Now in edit mode, again, simple man, I just have one quick favorite. And what that is in the overlays, the edge length. So a lot of times when I'm working on product design stuff or someone sends me CAD data, I need to make sure that things are properly scaled, and the edge length is great for that. So that's what that does, and I want to have it in my quick favorites. So right click, add to quick favorites. Now I can toggle it on and off so that we can see all our edge lengths. Now after we do that, you may notice that this brown color is a little bit unsightly. It's okay to see here, but sometimes when you're getting in complicated scenes with textures and things, it doesn't really stand out very well. So one thing that I like to do is change the color of that text. And the place we do that is Edit, Preferences, and then under Themes, we can go into Text Style, or sorry, it's not in Text Style. I think it's in the Viewport, 3D Viewport. And then I'm just going to scroll down and look for that nasty brown color, Edge Length Text. I'm going to click right there. And I'm going to change it to something brighter, edge length text. I usually change it to something like a teal or something like that. I think that looks good. Much more easy to read. And of course, you probably already know, but there's an effectively unlimited amount of things you can change in Blender, but that's the only one I'm worried about. Again, simple man. I'll leave it at that. So that's cool. Got the edge length hotkey, got the auto smooth hotkey. What do we need to look at next? Let's take a look at a couple of add-ons. So I'm going to go up here, Edit, Preferences, Add-ons. Now, these first ones we're going to talk about come in Blender by default. You don't need to download them or anything. The first one is one we've talked about a lot in my tutorials before, but that's the Node Wrangler add-on. So if we were to pull down a shader editor here, shader editor, and we wanted to add a new material, and let's say we wanted to have an image texture. Well, instead of pressing Shift A, texture, image texture, adding the mapping, you can just select that, press Control T. That's a hotkey that comes with the Node Wrangler add-on. Similarly, another hotkey that I'll use sometime, let's say we wanted to add in a transparent shader, and we wanted to mix these two together. You can press Shift Control, right click, drag between those. And that's just going to automatically add in a mix shader between those two that we drew that green line between. There's a lot of other things that the Node Wrangler add-on does, but those are just a couple of the things that I use it regularly for. So I would highly recommend adding that. We'll definitely be using it in my tutorials, and I'll usually try to call attention to it, but wanted to also make note of it here. The next add-on we will enable is going to be the Images as Planes add-on, another very basic one. If we press Shift A and add an image, then you'll just see we have an option for reference image and background image. But what we can do is turn on the Images as Planes add-on. So if we search for that, Images as Planes, turn that on, what that allows us to do is press Shift A, add an image, and then Images as Planes, which will then bring up a file browser where you could then go and find an image of your choice. I don't know what image we want to bring up here. Hey, look, it's a image from my wine tutorial. And the great thing about the Images as Planes add-on is that it's going to automatically bring it in at the proper aspect ratio. You can actually define a lot of things here. So you can define like the height of it when you bring it in. You can say whether or not you want it to use alpha. Like if you had a transparent JPEG, you can see it's automatically hooking up the alpha so that that works. Now the texture is on there. You can see it's been applied, but you would not see that until you actually went into rendered view there. So now that we're in rendered view, you can see that that has been properly applied just the way you want it to be. So that's great. That's the Images as Planes add-on. Let's open up a new version of Blender just to kind of get things back to where they were. We can see we still have, yes, the add-on has been retained. It's still there. So the next thing I want to talk about, next add-on is going to be the Loop Tools add-on. And what that does, let's just delete a couple of these faces here. Let's say we wanted to, I mean, again, very simple objects, so this wouldn't be a case where you really need the add-on, but the Loop Tools add-on. Normally, if you right-click, there's nothing that comes up here, and this is actually an edit mode thing, but edit, preferences, add-ons, and search for Loop Tools. This is a very convenient add-on for a couple things. I don't use it for a ton of stuff, but if we right-click, now we have this Loop Tools menu, and that does a couple things. Like one, for example, is Bridge, which will just bridge between those two things. There's another one where, like, let's say we wanted to flatten these all out. Right-click, Loop Tools, Flatten. That will make that so that they're all, nice and flat. It does a couple other things, but those are just a couple of the ones that I use regularly. So that is fantastic. Now there is one other add-on that I'd like to mention that you do have to download. It's from Remington Graphics. He's not a super active Blender user still, but and I don't know when the last time he updated the add-on was, but it seems to work really well still. It's called Atomic Data Manager. So if once you download that, you need to click install and then select the zip file. But what that does, you can see down here, it popped up this nice little menu here, which just gives you some stats about your Blender file, like how many lights, materials, things like that. Let's say like I accidentally added like 50 different materials here, and I just, instead of like going and just deleting them, again, these are fringe use cases where it'd be perfectly fine to just do it manually. But let's just say we, had a new object, another cube, and that didn't have any materials, and then we, deleted these two. Those materials are still in our file, and with a basic material like that, not a huge deal. But if you had image textures on all those, for example, that could really start to clog up your file. You can see we have 6 materials here now. So what you can do is use this Smart Select button, and that will notice that, hey, there's materials that are not being used. So then I can click Clean and then press OK, and that's going to remove those materials from my scene. Just keeps things a little bit nice and clean. Again, the primary place I use this is when I'm working with a lot of different image textures. Maybe you tried one wood texture and then you didn't like that, so you added in another wood texture. If you're saving your file over and over, and especially if you're packing those files in, then your Blender file can get really heavy with stuff that just doesn't need to be in there. So the Atomic Data Manager is really great for that. I'll try to put a link in the description to that, but thanks to Remington Graphics for that. The guy who made that grant, he works at NVIDIA now, I believe. So super smart dude, and yeah, appreciate the add-on. Another add-on I'll sometimes use is the Screencast Keys add-on, obviously when I'm recording tutorials. That's obviously convenient. Flip Fluids is another add-on that I will use, but don't typically leave it installed. But there's so many add-ons out there that you can use that are, in general, very helpful for particular people's particular processes, but I don't use a ton, and that is one of the ones that I really enjoy. So thanks, Grant, for that. Now let's talk about one more thing that has a little bit to do with animation. So let's insert some keyframes and then move down our timeline and then insert some more keyframes. Press I to insert those. And then I'm going to pull up a graph editor. So now we can see all the graphs here. And this is actually another point. This normalize option is very convenient. So what that does is just kind of normalize things from 0 to 1. So with the location, right now we're going from, 0 to like a -4, which is a pretty small range, as you can see here. But with the rotation, that's going up to like 168. It's a completely different range of numbers. So I think that this should be on by default in Blender, but the normalize option, I don't think that'll necessarily, and you can see I use my frame selected button there. I don't think that will carry over this normalize option. I think you have to check that every time, but that's just one convenience thing. But what I wanted to show you was, and this didn't used to be the case, but there's this thing, like a lot of times when I'm in the graph editor, I want to select, let's say I just want to select this little handle right there. If I shift and hold with circle select, it's going to it deletes, it messes up. It's just not selecting the way I want. If you follow me on Twitter, you would have seen that this was driving me crazy. This is something that I don't know if that was on purpose with the Blender developer. Someone please tell me, but it drove me crazy. It made Blender literally unusable for me, just based on the way I was used to working. And it took me a while to find the problem, but if you do some animation, then this might be something that you're interested in changing. I know for me, it's an absolute must-have, so got to make note of it. So that's going to be down in the key map, and then in the graph editor, and then graph editor global, circle select. Right there, there's this little button. This took forever to find. There's actually somebody that helped me on Twitter find what that was. And then they deleted the tweet for some reason, and it literally drove me insane again because I couldn't find it. But I finally found it, and now it's in this video, so if I ever lose it again, I can find it. But what that does is now allows me to do exactly what I wanted to do. It just makes selecting things way, way easier. So yeah, I don't like that. That used to be how it always worked, but something they changed recently, I don't know, it drove me crazy. But anyways, that's it for that one. That's a little bit more of a fringe use case, much more advanced than some of these other things we were talking about. Really, the bulk of the settings here are just really quick stuff in the navigation, for example. Those are things that super simple, easy checkboxes. I think they should be on default because that's how I use Blender. But of course, I wanted to share with you all today the things that I do change so that you can have Blender working well for you. As we mentioned, you can change so many things in Blender, basically unlimited amount of things, but just a few things can really improve your experience. So if you're following tutorials and stuff like that, I would highly recommend using pretty much basically default Blender settings, but there are a few things like that that aren't going to throw you off too much. That's going to just help mainly with navigation and just improve your experience overall. So make Blender yours. It is yours. It's free to use forever. And yeah, you can make it work for you. So those are just a few of the settings. Hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. Please share with me in the comments below if there's other settings that maybe I've overlooked that really help you out. Would love to get a good discussion going down there about what's going on. So thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.